On one winter night in 373 BC, a Greek city on this coast simply disappeared. No siege, no fire. The ground opened underneath it, and then the sea came in. By first light, there was no city on the plain at all. There was open water. 10 Spartan warships were anchored in the harbor that night. They went down too. 2,000 men came to recover the dead. They could not find a single body. This was no fishing village. Helike led the 12 cities of the Achaean League. Its sanctuary of Poseidon was one of the most important in the whole Peloponnese. For centuries afterwards, boatmen rowed over the site and looked down at the walls. Travelers were told a bronze statue of the god still stood upright under the water. Local fishermen knew exactly where it stood, because it kept tearing their nets. 5 centuries later, a traveler wrote the ruins were still there, eaten by salt. Then the water gave nothing back, and Helike dropped out of the world completely. People have been looking for this city, on and off, for 2,000 years. Sonar, magnetometers, divers, underwater cameras. The Gulf floor gave up nothing. There was a reason for all that failure, hiding inside one Greek word. Because Helike was never lying out in the open sea in the first place. This is the city Greeks used for centuries as their example of divine punishment. Using excavation and reconstruction, we rebuilt Helike as it stood in its last autumn. Then we walk through that night, hour by hour, as the sources describe it. And we show where the city actually was, and why nobody could ever find it. Start with the coast. Northern Peloponnese, the southern shore of the Gulf of Corinth. A strip of flat farmland, a few kilometers wide, between steep mountains and deep water. 2 rivers come down out of those mountains and cross the plain to the sea. They have been laying down soil here for a very long time. The land is superb. Vines, olives, grain, springs everywhere. In Achaea, this was the best ground there was. Now, the water. The Gulf of Corinth is not a bay at all. It is a rift. The Peloponnese is pulling away from mainland Greece, roughly a centimetre every year. It is one of the fastest opening rifts found anywhere on Earth today. The Gulf floor drops, the coastline moves, and faults run parallel to the shore. One of them runs directly under this plain. Geologists named it after the city, the Helike fault. These farmers were working the reason their own soil was rich. The same movement that drops the land also pushes groundwater up to the surface. Behind the beach ridge lay a coastal lagoon, shallow, brackish, fringed with reeds. Greek writers had a particular word for inland water like that. Poros. Hold on to that word. 2,000 years later, it decides everything. Helike also sat on the sea road between the 2 halves of the Gulf. Grain, timber, pottery, and pilgrims all moved past this shore constantly. The harbor was shallow and open, with a short walk inland to the city itself. This was no fortress on a crag. It was a rich, flat, wide-open town. On any ordinary night, that was an advantage. On one night, it was not. Helike led the Achaean League, 12 cities strung out along this coast. They all met in its sanctuary, at the great altar of Poseidon Helikonios. Poseidon was god of the sea, god of horses, and god of earthquakes. The Greeks called him the Earth Shaker. This city's identity ran straight through him. A bronze statue of the god stood in the precinct, considerably larger than a man. Colonists from this city are said to have founded Sybaris in southern Italy. Sybaris became the ancient world's byword for wealth and soft living. Ionian Greeks across the Aegean traced their Poseidon cult back to this coast. Their own federal sanctuary used the same rare title, Poseidon Helikonios. A small Achaean city was the religious mother of cities hundreds of miles away, which is why its destruction was remembered everywhere for centuries afterwards. So what did it actually look like? Start at the shore and walk inland. Boats drawn up on shingle, net racks, sheds, the smell of pitch and salt. Then vines and olive terraces, field walls, threshing floors, scattered farmhouses. Then the town itself, stone footings, mud brick walls, terracotta roof tiles, narrow lanes, blank house fronts, everything opening inward onto private courtyards. No grand avenues. Greek cities of this period were built plainly and densely. The public space was the agora, packed earth, colonnades, stalls, a water basin, and above it, on the best ground in the town, the walled precinct of Poseidon. And that precinct is where this city's story ends. Keep it in view. The temple itself was limestone, Doric and painted, in bright red, blue and ochre over the carved stone. Greek temples were never bare white marble. That idea belongs to a much later age, and it is wrong. Inside stood the god himself. Outside stood the altar, and the altar is where the real ritual happened. Sacrifice here was public, loud and edible, and most of the meat was handed straight back to the people. 12 cities sent their delegates to this precinct, argued inside it, and swore their oaths at this altar. Around the sanctuary sat the working town, potters, dye vats, a small bronze foundry, carpenters, tanners. Achaean towns like this one lived on wine, oil, wool, fish, and on other people's shipping passing by. A house meant a courtyard, a hearth, a loom against the wall, and storage jars sunk into the earth floor. Roofs were heavy, baked clay tiles laid on timber beams, and all of that weight carried by mud brick. Remember that weight. In an earthquake, a tiled roof over mud brick walls is the thing that kills you. Water came up out of springs and wells all across the plain, and there was never any shortage of it. The plain was crowded. Villages, farmsteads, roadside shrines, and the town of Bura in the hills above. Bura stood inland and higher up the slope, a few kilometers away. Hold on to that town as well. 2 towns, 1 coastal plain, and a single fault line running directly underneath both of them. Now, the people. Nobody wrote their names down, so everything we say about them comes out of the ground. A farming population, a fishing population, and a small class of families who owned the ships. The year began in the fields, and everything else on this plain arranged itself around the year. Autumn meant ploughing and sowing, and it was also the closing weeks of the sailing season. Winter meant rain, storms, and repair work, and it meant the ships came out of the water altogether. Spring belonged to the vines, and the early summer to the grain harvest out on the flat ground. Late summer belonged to the threshing floor, and to the share taken out of everything grown. Then came the olives, which kept the whole plain working until the cold weather came back round. The oil went into jars, the jars went onto ships, and the ships went west out of the Gulf. Wine, oil, and wool bought timber, worked metal, saltfish, and good painted pottery from abroad. Coined silver existed by now, but most of this plain still ran on weight, memory, and trust. The household was the unit that mattered here, and the open courtyard was the center of it. Wool was carded, spun, and woven at home, right through the winter, and the work never stopped. Bread, olives, cheese, small fish, beans, and watered wine. That was most days, for most households. Most people here ate fish far more often than meat, because the Gulf was 15 minutes away. And almost everything a household owned would fit into one room with a hearth in it. Meat arrived on festival days, which is one of the several reasons festivals were so popular. Fresh water was everywhere on this plain, which for a Greek city was very close to a miracle. The land fed the town easily, so the town could afford cut stone, bright paint, and cast bronze. Poseidon here was not only the god of the sea, he was also, just as strongly, the god of horses. Horse breeding on a flat coastal plain meant wealth, status, cavalry, and real political weight. Races were run in his honor on the flat ground by the shore, and the winning families carved it into stone. The festival filled the whole town. league delegates, traders, farming families, and animals. There were games as well: running, wrestling, and the horse races the god particularly liked. The prizes were modest. The real value was the public record of having won them at all. For a few days each year, a small city on a small plain was the center of the whole of Achaea. Then everyone went home again, the tents came down, and the plain went quietly back to work. Almost everything we know about that ordinary daily life reaches us through broken pottery. Cups, bowls, cooking pots, lamps, and storage jars. Dull material and extraordinarily useful. Pottery dates a layer to within a generation, which is exactly why the fine ware matters so much. And in one layer under this plane, that pottery stops dead in the middle of the 4th century. But that is the end of the story. Go back to the town for a moment, while all of it is still standing. Late autumn, 373 BC. The grain is in, the ships are up on the beach, and the weather has turned. The eastern Mediterranean is in the middle of a long, expensive, and thoroughly exhausting war. Sparta and Athens are fighting each other for control of the sea routes that run west out of Greece. Everything heading west out of the Aegean passes along this coast, through this gulf, past this harbor. Achaea is allied with Sparta, and Spartan squadrons use Achaean harbors whenever they need to. That winter, 10 Spartan warships were lying in the harbor at Helike, waiting out the season. Triremes are light, fragile, and waterlogged. In winter, they get hauled out or laid up somewhere safe. A trireme carried around 200 men, most of them rowing on 3 stacked levels. 10 hulls could mean well over 1,000 men, although nobody recorded how many wintered there. A friendly harbor on the route west, sheltered by a wall of mountains, was exactly where you wanted them. So the crews were ashore for weeks on end, in a town that was expecting nothing at all to happen. Several hundred extra men, in a town of a few thousand, all of them waiting out the weather. Nobody in that harbor was thinking about the danger, because the danger was underneath them. The city was a league capital, which meant the argument of that year happened here as well. 12 cities, 1 shared sanctuary, and 1 extremely touchy question about who actually owned it. Because the sanctuary belonged to the whole league, but the ground under it belonged to Helike alone. And then a delegation arrived from the far side of the Aegean and asked this city for something. The Ionian cities of Asia worshipped the same god under the same unusual title as this precinct. Their tradition said the cult had come from this coast, and they wanted something to prove it. According to the ancient accounts, what they asked for first was the cult statue of Poseidon itself. Failing that, they wanted a model of the altar so that they could copy it exactly at home in Asia. The League as a whole voted to allow it. The people of Helike and Bora refused, and refused flatly. Their argument was simple enough. The sanctuary stands on our own land, so the god belongs to us. What happens next is the part every ancient writer repeats, and not one of them was there to see it. They say the envoys took refuge at the altar, which in Greek terms should have made them untouchable. And they say the men of Helike dragged them off that stone anyway, and killed them where they stood. For a Greek audience, that single act on its own explains absolutely everything that follows it. Killing a suppliant at an altar was close to the worst thing a Greek city could possibly do. So be careful here. What survives is a moral story first, and a historical account a long way second. Every version of it that we have was written down long after the city itself was already gone. The oldest surviving accounts come 3 centuries later, and they are working from books now lost. One account comes from a Sicilian Greek historian, working 3 centuries after the event. Another comes from a geographer, quoting a scientist who had actually visited this coast. A third comes from a travel writer of the Roman Empire, who walked the site himself. They disagree on the details, and they all share exactly the same moral frame. They are describing a real event, and they are simultaneously explaining why it was deserved. An earthquake with no reason behind it is unbearable. A punishment, at least, makes sense of it. Hold both of those thoughts at the same time, and the story stays honest all the way through, because the physical event needs no divine anger whatsoever. The fault underneath was quite enough. It had moved before this night. It has moved many times since, right up to the present day. Today, that movement is measured directly with satellite positioning year after year. The two sides of this gulf are still separating, and the instruments show it plainly. People here lived with small shocks, the way coastal towns everywhere live with winter storms. Cracked plaster, a shifted jar, a night spent outdoors. Then everything went back to normal. Nothing in that experience prepares a city for the ground itself dropping away underneath it. The sources insist that the warnings that winter were different, and they list them one by one. 5 days before the end, they say, the animals began leaving the city, and they kept leaving. Rats, weasels, snakes, centipedes and beetles, all moving in one column out toward the hills. The people of the town watched them go, and had absolutely no idea what to do with the sight. Our source for that detail is a philosopher writing within living memory of the city itself. His book is lost. A Roman-era writer on animals quoted the passage, and that quotation survived. Which is how most of this story reaches us at all, as a quotation sitting inside a quotation. Modern seismology has heard the animal story 1,000 times from every corner of the world. It has never once turned into a working prediction in any country, despite decades of trying. But something physical does happen in the ground before a large rupture, and it is measurable. Water tables shift, wells go cloudy or drop away. Gas seeps up out of the soil and the rock. Small foreshocks rattle the roof tiles for days, and everyone quickly learns to ignore them. An animal that lives down in a burrow, in the soil itself, feels all of that before a person does. So the detail is not evidence of prophecy, and it is not complete nonsense either. Leave it there. The same sources describe a great column of fire standing in the sky over those same nights. Lights before and during earthquakes are still reported today, and they are still argued about. Or it was a comet, or a burning building, or a later addition to the story. There is no way to check. Strip all of the omens away, and the picture in front of us does not change in the slightest. A rich, flat, crowded city, built on soft, wet ground, sitting directly above an active fault. Heavy tiled roofs carried on mud brick walls, and a shallow sea a few hundred meters away. Everything that happens next follows directly from those 4 facts, and from nothing else at all. So take that last day as a completely ordinary winter day, because that is exactly what it was. Deep winter, short daylight, cold rain coming off the Gulf, mud in the lanes, everything shuttered. Boats hauled up on the shingle, nets drying on the racks, and several hundred sailors with nothing to do. The market only half full, and the sanctuary quiet now that the festival season had finished. Bread baked, animals fed, oil pressed, cloth on the loom, storage jars filled, sealed and covered. Fires banked down under ash in the courtyards as the last light went out of the winter sky. Down in the harbour, watchmen sat out the cold night beside the 10 moored Spartan warships. Up in the hill town of Bora, 6 kilometers away, the same quiet evening was coming to an end. A few thousand people going to sleep on the same flat, soft, waterlogged piece of ground. It is worth stopping there for a moment, because at that hour every single thing is still standing. The temple stood. The bronze statue stood. The treasury and the archive of the League stood. This plain had been farmed more or less continuously for at least 2,000 years already. There is a Bronze Age town buried under these same fields, and we will come back to it later. The city had a past, a treasury, ships, allies, a full harbour, and a good year behind it all. It had, at that particular moment, no future whatsoever, and no possible way of knowing that. The sources agree on the timing only roughly, the middle of the night, in the depth of winter. What follows is the best physical reconstruction anyone can offer of the next several hours. Nobody in that town had a word for what a fault line does. What they had instead was a god. Underneath the plain, a locked block of rock had been quietly storing strain for centuries. That night, it finally slipped. A few meters of stored movement, released in a couple of seconds. The first thing is the sound. A deep roar coming up out of the ground underneath the town. Then the shaking itself arrives. Hard, largely vertical, violent, and mercifully short. Mud brick does not bend, and it does not flex. It shears straight through, and then it drops. And then the roofs come down into the houses, with the heavy clay tiles falling in first. That is what kills people in earthquakes. Then and now, in every country, their own roofs. 20 seconds, perhaps 40 of them, more than long enough to finish an entire town off. In the sanctuary, the temple columns go over in a row, like a line of felled trees on a ridge. Stone drums roll across the precinct, and the painted entablature breaks apart on the ground. The bronze statue stays standing through all of it, and that detail is going to matter later. Up in the hill town, 6 kilometers inland, the same shock is doing exactly the same work. Bura is destroyed on the same night by the same shock, and the sea never comes near it at all. That single difference decided the future of both towns, and it decided it immediately. Bura was rebuilt. The ground was still there, the wells still worked, the site stayed dry. Helike could not be rebuilt, because the place it had stood on was now underneath water. One town lost its buildings. The other town lost the ground the buildings stood on. Then the second thing happens, and it is the part that nobody in the town sees coming. The ground under this plain is river silt and sand, saturated with groundwater all the way down. Shaken hard enough for long enough, that mixture stops behaving like solid ground altogether. It behaves like a liquid instead. Buildings sink down into it, and water and sand come up. Foundations tilt, walls slide apart, and the surface of the fields opens and closes again. And then the whole block of land drops. That is not a figure of speech. It is measurable. Cosismic subsidence. A coastal plain like this one can lose several meters of height in seconds. Helike stood a meter or two above the level of the sea. Do the arithmetic from there. The city is now sitting below the level of the water, lying a few hundred meters in front of it. Nobody needed to be near the shore for this to matter. The whole plain was low ground. A drop of 2 meters is nothing on a mountain. On a plain like this, it is everything. The sea does not need a wave to take ground like that. But that night, there was a wave. First, the water pulls back off the shore, much further out than anybody there has ever seen it. The bay drains, the boats settle onto the mud, and there is a strange short silence. Then it comes back. Not as a breaking wave, but as a rising wall of black water. The Gulf of Corinth produces waves like that fairly regularly, and it still does today. A fault can lift or drop the seafloor, and an underwater landslide can do the same job. In a gulf this narrow, the water has nowhere to spread, so the wave arrives fast and high. It crosses the beach ridge, fills the lagoon behind it, and keeps going inland over the fields. The moored ships are lifted off their anchors, driven inland and swamped in the dark. 10 Spartan warships end that night, sitting in what had been somebody's ploughed field. The water runs through the ruins of the town in the dark, carrying the wreckage with it. Anything still standing after the shaking comes down now, under the weight of the water. And when the sea finally settles again, it does not go back to where it came from. The plane that dropped stays dropped, and the water simply stays there on top of it. By dawn, the entire city is lying under shallow, muddy, standing saltwater, and staying there. Who survived? The people who happened not to be down on the plain that particular night. Shepherds in the hills, travelers on the road, and the farms up on the higher ground. The sources give no number at all for the dead, and neither, honestly, will we. We do not know how many people lived there. Every figure you will read is a guess. What we do have is a single number, and it is a number about the living, not the dead. 2,000 men were sent from the other Achaean cities to recover the bodies. They arrived within days and found a shallow lagoon sitting where a city had been. They worked it with poles, ropes, and small boats, moving over the drowned streets. And they could not find the dead at all. That is the detail which unsettled everybody. The backwash had probably taken them out, or the liquefied silt had taken them down. For Greeks, burial was not optional. This was a second disaster, stacked on top of the first. And there was no city left standing in which to bury anybody anyway, and no ground to dig. The League had lost its capital and its meeting place in the course of a single night. The assembly moved a few kilometers along the coast to Aegean, and it never came back. Aegean went on hosting the meetings of the Achaean League for centuries afterwards. The League itself survived, and a century and a half later, a refounded version ran the Peloponnese. By then, nobody alive had ever seen the city that used to run it. Helike's land was absorbed by its neighbors because there was nobody left to claim it. The news traveled fast, and the Ionian cities across the sea heard it as an answer. Delphi heard it too. The whole Greek world took the story up and used it as a lesson. The philosophical schools argued about the cause, and they did not agree with each other either. Some Greeks already thought earthquakes were water and trapped air, not divine anger. That argument was already old by then, and Helike handed both sides a perfect case study. Meanwhile, the site itself was quietly getting on with something else entirely. The drowned plane settled down into a shallow lagoon lying behind the line of the coast. Salt water, soft mud, and reeds growing back in along the edges of it within a few years. For a while, the tops of the walls still stood a little way above the surface of the water. Boats could row straight across the site and look down into the streets underneath them. And the bronze statue of Poseidon stood upright in the shallow water through all of it. That was still true 150 years after the city itself had died. A Hellenistic geographer came to this coast and asked the local ferrymen about it directly. They told him the statue was still standing out there, a small sea creature in its hand. And they warned him that it wrecked their nets, which is how fishermen remember anything. He wrote it down. His book is lost. A later geographer quoted him. So we still have it. Now look closely at what those ferrymen actually said about where the statue was standing. Not in the sea. In the poros, the passage, the channel, the inland stretch of water. Nobody paid any serious attention to that one word for the next 2,000 years. For Roman-era travelers, the drowned city was simply another stop on the coast road. A Greek writer came through in the 2nd century after Christ and wrote the whole place up. He says the ruins are still visible under the water, but that the salt has eaten them away. He says the wave took away the trees of the sacred grove of Poseidon entirely, root and branch. And he retells the story of the murdered envoys, because by then that had become the story. He writes like a man describing something he has seen himself. We cannot check whether he did. Roman writers used Helike constantly as standing proof of what the sea is able to take. A Roman poet dropped it into a long poem about things that change shape and disappear. A Roman philosopher used it in an entire book about earthquakes, and he had a reason to. He was writing immediately after an earthquake wrecked several towns in the Bay of Naples. His conclusion was simple. There is nowhere safe, and moving somewhere else will not help. Roman readers found the story of Helike genuinely frightening, in a very practical way. The city became shorthand for an entire community erased inside a single winter night. And then something changed on the ground itself, quietly, over several generations. The two rivers kept dumping gravel and silt straight into the new lagoon every winter. Every winter, flood laid down another layer of sediment on top of the drowned city. The lagoon shrank, filled in, and gradually turned into ordinary marshy wet ground. Wet ground became pasture, and in time that pasture became ploughed fields again. And the coastline itself moved outward as the sediment built the land out into the Gulf. Within a few centuries, the drowned site was dry, ordinary farmable land once more. So people came back and built on top of it, with no idea at all what was underneath them. A Roman period settlement stood directly above the buried Greek city and worked its fields, which is precisely what the excavation eventually found, one layer sitting above the other. By then, the walls were no longer visible from any boat, at any season of the year. Nothing marked the spot at all anymore. The name had come loose from the place, and the description in the books stayed frozen exactly as it had first been written down. It sank into the sea. That one sentence sent everybody looking in the wrong element. But before the site vanished completely, Helike did one more thing to the ancient world. It got into the most famous story about a drowned civilization that anyone has ever written. Around 360 BC, an elderly Athenian philosopher was at work on two long dialogues. In them, a great island power offends the gods and is destroyed completely for doing it. In a single day and night of misfortune, he writes, it disappeared into the depths of the sea. He was writing roughly 15 years after Helike itself had gone under the water. An old man in Athens, in a Greek world that had been talking about very little else. Every Greek reading that passage knew that a real city had just done exactly that. Now, the honest part. Plato never mentions Helike at all. Not once, in anything he wrote. He says his story came out of Egypt, handed down through a famous Athenian lawmaker. Historians generally treat that framing as a literary device and not as a source note. So the connection between the two of them is an inference, it is not evidence. But it is an old inference, and entirely serious people have made it in print for decades. In the middle of the 20th century, a well-known excavator argued the case directly. The same mechanism, the same phrase, the same sea, and the same generation of readers. Atlantis is a parable about power and hubris. It was never intended as geography. Helike is the exact opposite, a small real city with no moral attached to it at all. And the parable swallowed the city. Everybody knows the one name and almost nobody the other, which is a strange fate for the place that may well have supplied the original image. After antiquity, the record on Helike goes quiet for well over 1,000 years. Byzantine centuries, then Ottoman centuries, and the plain was farmed right through them. The name survived in books. The place itself did not survive anywhere on any map. European travelers arrived in the 18th and 19th centuries with the texts in hand. They tried to match the ancient descriptions to the coastline lying in front of them. They knew roughly which stretch of shore it had to be. They still could not find the city. Then, in December 1861, the ground itself gave them a full-scale demonstration. A large earthquake struck this exact plain along this exact fault line in the winter. The coast dropped, and the sea came straight in across the shore and over the fields. A whole settlement went underwater, and the mechanism stopped being a theory on paper. Geologists mapped the rupture and named the fault line after the ancient city itself. The same fault, the same effect, on the same plane, 22 centuries apart exactly. And in 1995, the same fault system moved again and badly damaged the nearest modern town. So the mechanism is not hypothetical at all. It is periodic, and it is still running. But the search for the ancient city still went straight out into the open water. In the 1950s, a well-known excavator argued that the city lay somewhere out in the Gulf. He also argued it was the original of Atlantis, which put the search in the newspapers. From that point on, essentially everybody looked offshore and almost nowhere else. sonar surveys, magnetometers towed behind boats, divers working carefully measured grids, underwater cameras dragged back and forth across the bottom of the Gulf for weeks at a time. Every single survey found seabed, silt, and absolutely nothing else whatsoever. And there was a geological problem sitting underneath the entire search effort. The floor of the Gulf here does not shelve gently. It drops steeply into deep water. River sediment slides down that slope, so nothing shallow stays where it originally fell. Then, in 1988, a project started from the other end entirely, by reading the words again. An archaeologist and an astrophysicist went back through every surviving ancient account. The word those ferrymen used was poros, and it does not have to mean the open sea at all. In this landscape, it fits an inland lagoon, or a shallow channel lying behind the shore. And a plain that drops below sea level is covered by the sea, accurately and permanently, which means the city should be under the plain itself, and not out in the Gulf at all. And the rivers have been steadily burying that lagoon ever since the night it formed. That produces a testable prediction, a buried lagoon layer sitting under the modern fields. So they drilled. Not trenches, not at first. Boreholes, right the way across the plain. Core after core, a metre at a time, logged, sampled, dated, and plotted onto a map. And in those cores they found it. A marine lagoon layer, buried under river gravel. Shells that only live in brackish water, sitting several meters below somebody's olive grove. Below and around that layer were the levels where people had actually been living and working. Then a magnetometer survey across the fields to find the walls without digging for them. Then came the trenches. And in the 1990s, those trenches started producing buildings. A Roman period settlement first, sitting about 3 meters below the modern surface. Then, underneath the destruction silt, a 4th century layer that simply stops dead. Pottery of exactly the right date. Walls, floors, doorways, and then nothing above it. That layer is the city that died on a winter night in 373 BC, lying under the fields. The site lies roughly 2 kilometers inland from where today's beach actually is, under 3 to 12 meters of river sediment, under working vines and olive trees. Excavation is slow because the water table is high and the trenches keep filling up. The plain is still doing to the archaeologists exactly what it once did to the city. The project also found something that nobody had been looking for at all. An older town, an early Bronze Age settlement on the same plain, dating to around 2400 BC. That older town had been abandoned after its own disaster and was never reoccupied. Which means this plain has now buried 2 separate settlements in almost the same way. Also destroyed by an earthquake. Also buried and lost 2,000 years earlier is the same ground, the same fault, and the same ending, twice over in 2,000 years. So here is the twist of this whole story, and it is an extremely quiet one. Helike was never lost at sea at all. Helike was lost underneath a farmer's field. Everyone searched the water for 2,000 years because of a single Greek word. The ancient world's great symbol of the deep is lying quietly under olive trees. And it is still mostly there, unexcavated, a few meters down, all across that plain. Finds from the plain are cleaned, conserved and studied in the nearest modern town. Every season adds a few more walls, a few more floors, and a few more storage jars. The excavation is a slow argument with a river delta, and the delta is still winning, underneath the same fault line, which has not finished with this coast yet. And somewhere under those roots, a bronze statue is lying on its side in the silt. Nobody has found it yet. Subscribe if you want to keep uncovering the city's history nearly forgot.